Hello and welcome to STEM with Mr. N, where I perform different demonstrations and explain the science behind what we're seeing. This week I'm going to make a cloud in a jar and explore why it rains as I look at the science of clouds. Let's check it out. To understand cloud formation, first you need to understand the processes of vaporisation, water turning from a liquid into a gas, and condensation, water turning from a gas into a liquid. If you have ever boiled a pot of water, you have seen the vaporisation process. The molecules of water, when it is in a liquid form, are packed very close together. They're packed so close together, in fact, that it allows the hydrogen in the water molecule to bond with the hydrogen in the other molecules round about it. As you heat a pot of water, you're giving energy to these molecules. If you give enough energy to the molecules, the bonds that they've made in liquid form start to break and the water turns from a liquid into a gas and starts to rise out of the pot of water. As this gas starts to rise out of the pot of water, it spreads out and starts to cool down, losing that heat energy, which allows the water to turn from gas back into tiny water droplets. I did a video previously where I explored more in depth the water molecule bonds, what happens while you're boiling water, and how to boil water in a paper cup over an open flame, so I've put a link in the description for you to be able to check that out. But right now, for cloud formation, all you really need to understand is that when you heat water, it vaporises, turning from a liquid into a gas, and when you cool that gas, it condenses, turning from a gas back into tiny water droplets. Now, outside of the kitchen, warm air rises, and as this warm air rises, it also expands and cools, turning from a gas into tiny water droplets. This condensation is the same as the water that you can see on your grass on an early spring morning. Now it's time to use these processes of vaporisation and condensation and add something a little extra to make a cloud in a jar and explain how clouds form outside. To make a cloud in a jar, you will need a glass jar with a lid, some hairspray, some boiling water and some ice cubes. Because this experiment involves using boiling water, you will need an adult to supervise or assist you with this experiment. Also, you need to do the first 3 steps of this experiment really quickly in order for you to be able to make a cloud in a jar. First, I'm going to pour about 125 millilitres of boiling water into the glass jar. Then I'm going to spray in 4 big puffs of hairspray, quickly screw the lid onto the top of the jar and put a couple of ice cubes on top of the lid. Then I'm going to sit back and watch what happens. You will notice that very quickly a cloud is forming inside my jar. This is because the boiling water has enough energy for the liquid water to go through that vaporisation process, and it is rising up through the jar as a gas. When it is reaching the lid of the jar where the ice cubes are, this gas is very quickly cooling into tiny water droplets. Now, why did I add in the hairspray? Because there isn't hairspray outside. Well, outside, floating around in the air, what there are tiny dust particles. When the warm air rises with the water vapour inside it, expands and cools, the water droplets, when they turn back into a liquid, cling on to these tiny particles of dust. Billions of these tiny particles of dust is what forms clouds in the sky. This is exactly what is happening inside my jar. As that water vapour is condensing when it's hitting the lid with the ice cubes on it at the top, the water droplets are clinging onto the particles of hairspray. Now when I take the lid off the jar, you'll notice that some wisps of cloud are starting to come out of the jar as the warm air rises out of the jar into the room around me. To show that the cloud was formed in the jar as a result of that vaporisation process, the warm water turning into a gas and rising up through the jar, I'm going to show you what would happen with the experiment if you did it with cold water. So here I've got my empty jar and I'm going to pour cold water into the jar. Then I'm going to spray in 4 big puffs of hairspray, screw the lid on and put the ice cubes on top of the lid. This time you'll notice there is no cloud forming inside the jar. This is because the cold water doesn't have enough energy to break those water molecule bonds, so there is no vaporisation process. The water is not turning from a liquid into a gas, it's not rising up through the jar, and it's not condensing when it reaches the lid which has the ice cubes on it. This was just to show that it was not just a trick of using hairspray in the jar, but that it is a result of that vaporisation process, the water molecules condensing back into water droplets and sitting on those particles of hairspray, whereas outside they would sit on particles of dust. Now that I've explored why clouds form, it's time to explore why clouds rain. For this experiment, you will need an empty plastic cup or glass, some shaving foam, some food colouring, a dropper and some cold water. I'm not going to be using a dropper because the top of my food colouring tub has a small dropper hole in it, allowing me to do individual drops. But if you don't have food colouring like that, you will need a plastic dropper to do this experiment. The first thing I'm going to do is fill up the cup until it is almost completely full of water, leaving just about an inch from the top. Then I'm going to use my shaving foam and spray this so it sits on top of the water inside the cup, filling up that final inch. The shaving foam is to represent a cloud and the water is to represent our atmosphere that our clouds sit on. Then I'm going to use the food colouring and start putting small drops of food colouring on top of my cloud. As I add more and more food colouring, my cloud is getting heavier and heavier with that water vapour, which is what the food colouring stands for. You'll notice that as I continue to add food colouring to my cloud, that some of the food colouring starts to rain down through the water. This is just like what happens with clouds. As we explored in the previous experiment, clouds are made up of water vapour, which is condensed back into water droplets that cling to particles of dust. When a cloud gets really heavy with lots and lots of water droplets, eventually gravity pulls these water droplets back down towards the earth, and that is what rain is. And you'll notice that even with the camera inside the water, when it is covered in food colouring, you'll see water droplets hit off the camera just like rain hits off window panes. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe button to stay up to date with all future videos. As always, I would like to take this opportunity to answer any science questions you have about any science topics at all. So feel free to email me at stemwithmrn@outlook.com and I'll get back to you with answers to your questions. You can subscribe to the channel by pushing the button here, and I've added links here to the other STEM demos I've done so far, here to my STEM career interviews, and here to my robot review videos. This has been STEM with Mr. N, exploring clouds.